Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this afternoon. We have over 70 people registered to attend the webinar, which shows the intense interest that we have in the sector to improving our practices towards preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. So thank you again for spending some time with us this afternoon. Introductions. So my name's Sophie. I am the Standards and Code Lead at the Australian Council for International Development. Together with my colleagues, we are the custodians of the ACFID Code of Conduct. The code was developed for members, by members, and in that spirit, our role, my role and our team is to support and guide members to meet compliance, and also to support our ACFID members to be champions of good practice. I'd like to introduce our experts today, Jo Thompson and Belinda Lucas, both directors from Learning for Development. Jo and Belinda, between them, have over 25 years of development practitioner experience. They have the benefit of having worked in country and communities, also for Australian NGOs, and have the added perspective of from the outside looking in. So they are accredited assessors through the DFAT ANCP program. They also have been instrumental in contributing to the code review that happened a couple of years ago. And they have been most recently advising both Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and ACFID as to how we can better our approach to PSEAH. So welcome aboard, Jo and Belinda. Thank you. So today, how we plan on running the webinar, we'll go a bit through some background and context. It's important to just take a look back before we understand where we got to and where we're going to in this regard. Look at how the code has changed in response to PSEAH. Key considerations, so we'll talk slightly for a moment on DFAT alignment with their policy and the language that we use. We'll unpack what a survivor-centred approach looks like, and then Jo and Belinda will also elaborate on actions to develop a PSEAH policy and what you could be including in your policy. And importantly, how to work with partners to implement our policy approach. We'll highlight some available resources that are available on our website and have some time at the end for question and answers. So feel free to pop your questions down as we're going, if that's the best method for you, or you could hold on to the questions and pop them in at the end in that dedicated Q&A session, whatever works for you. So a bit about context and background. So ultimately, how did we get here? In light of serious allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse and the subsequent mishandling of those reports and complaints, they were made public through the global media in early 2018. And the international development community took notice, serious notice. Whilst it didn't involve Australian NGOs and it didn't involve ACFID members, it was the gravity of the situation was as such that we needed to take stock of what we were currently doing, what members had in place to ensure that to prevent any incidents like that happening under our stewardship. So ACFID undertook a number of reviews. The first one, or the larger one, is called the Independent Review on the Prevention of Sexual Misconduct. It was a review into sector-wide practice in relation to PSEAH. The result of that review is a really thorough report, the picture of which is on the right-hand side of the screen. It outlines 33 recommendations for strengthening sector-wide practice and culture in relation to PSEAH. ACFID commissioned the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine to undertake that review. Second, the other review that we did was a code review. So whilst we acknowledged that we had a number of mechanisms through the ACFID Code of Conduct in place to allow members to actively have a number of safeguards in place, we needed to understand if that was good enough. Were they working? Were there gaps? Were there areas that the ACFID Code of Conduct could be strengthened? So that code review was undertaken last year. It resulted in a number of recommended changes. That review was conducted by Learning for Development, and I'll talk about those changes in a second. So also wanted to note that the reviews, ACFID undertook them, but we also, members contributed largely to the content of those reviews. They also contributed through funding opportunities, and the reviews were received generous funding from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So it was a very much a shared initiative, sector initiative to taking stock of what we needed to do. So the recommended changes kind of came about in two different phases. The first was the recommendation to introduce a specific commitment that has already landed in the ACFID Code of Conduct. It was swiftly adopted and voted in at last year's AGM. And that introduced commitment asks members to advance the safeguarding of those vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse. So it is a commitment that specifically targets the issue head on, and it requires members to have a policy approach. The other lot of changes will happen in the Code's Quality Assurance Framework. So they are already finalised and they are already available online, but they haven't bedded down in terms of an implementation date. So they will come into effect for members on the 31st of December this year. The Quality Assurance Framework is largely the infrastructure that supports the ACFID Code of Conduct. So it's where the detail lies. It's where the compliance verifiers and the compliance indicators live. So these incoming changes are many. There is not just one, there is a number. But and so they're small, but they're mighty if they all work together. They don't require members to create whole new policies and whole new approaches. Rather, they build on members' existing policies and approaches and ask members to review and adapt and strengthen those in a number of places. So when you consider the introduced commitment that's already taken place and the incoming changes to the Code's Quality Assurance Framework, you see the full picture of how the ACFID Code has changed and strengthened itself to present an enhanced package of how to help prevent sexual exploitation and abuse. I might quickly show you where those changes live on the website. So we have a good practice toolkit online available for everyone, and it is a treasure trove of information. The Quality Principle 1.5 sits here. You can see the commitment up here, the compliance indicator here, the verifier. So this is the bit in the code that asks members to have a policy approach to PSEAH and what needs to, at the very minimum, go in that policy. There is a really good guidance section which serves to unpack what that verifier means. And I did want to point out some great good practice guidance down the bottom of that page, which offers up some practical suggestions for your organisation to strengthen over time. So they relate to a number of areas that you could be thinking about. There's also the resources section, which I'll refer to at the very end of the webinar. So that's commitment 1.5. The incoming quality assurance framework changes I spoke about, they have already landed in the good practice toolkit. So they are already incorporated in the various places in the code. But if you did want to have a look at what they are, and they are also in one spot, which is located here. So the PSEAH changes, you could click on that document and you'll see a PDF of what they are. But you can also see that the changes lie in a number of places throughout the code. So for example, Quality Principle 5, Compliance Indicator 5.1.2. This is already in place. Our members will already have a documented assessment process with partners that looks at capacity assessment for implementation of key safeguarding and risk policies. And in this case, the bit in khaki is the introduction. So we're itemising and outlining that capacity assessment also needs to consider how partners are travelling with the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. So that gives you an example of those incoming QOF changes. This one. Great. So we won't go into, don't have enough time today to go into all those changes. We're here rather to listen to Jo and Belinda talk about policy development and considerations behind how those changes came about. But if those changes all are feeling a bit overwhelming and a bit complicated, another way of looking at it is to all of the changes work together to do one of four things. So they can be grouped into four broad priorities that do make much more sense. So, and they are that our staff and volunteers must clearly understand that sexual exploitation, abuse or harassment in any form is unacceptable. That primary stakeholders, the communities where we work, should know that staff and volunteers have an expected standard of behaviour. The communities where we work must also have a gender and culturally sensitive and confidential means of making a complaint of sexual exploitation and abuse. And our organisations must have established incident reporting and good management systems that specify investigation procedures for sensitive investigations, such as allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse. A question that's coming to us quite a lot, and it's a very valid one, is how are these changes working to intersect with other standards that are placed out there in the wider sector, especially in terms of the DFAT's release of their policy in April this year. So it's a really valuable question. Just shy of half our members are DFAT accredited NGOs, and of the portion that are not receiving funding from DFAT, suspect that a number aspire to partner in DFAT in the future. So it's a good question, and we might take a moment to have a look at that. The good news is that ultimately we are singing from the same songbook. Both DFAT and ACFID have drawn from best practice in the international setting in terms of PSEAH. Both have considered the recommendations coming from the independent review and use those recommendations to inform our approach. So in terms of the entire package of how the code has enhanced itself to increase safeguarding against sexual exploitation and abuse, the terminology and the principles are consistent with DFAT's policy approach. It should be noted, though, that DFAT's policy does refer to a set of minimum standards, and these standards apply differently based on the assessed risk of the setting in which an organisation works. So ultimately, that is a mechanism that the ACFID Code doesn't prescribe. So we're not comparing apples with apples, and mapping one set of requirements to another is not an exact science. But ultimately, they are consistent with the code's changes. There were two areas that have been identified as different, and that is that they relate to transactional sex, and they also relate to fraternisation. So the ACFID Code of Conduct does require members to have a policy on transactional sex that is clear to all personnel. It does not specify that that policy must prohibit transactional sex. In terms of the DFAT's PSEAH policy, it prohibits transactional sex for all personnel while engaged in the direct delivery of DFAT business, but this applies in high-risk areas only. So slight difference. In terms of fraternisation, minimum standard 7 of DFAT's policy prohibits fraternisation for all personnel when engaged in the direct delivery of DFAT business. The code does not refer to fraternisation or an equivalent term, so that is a clear difference. The other question we wanted to answer at the forefront of the webinar was the question about PSEA or PSEAH. So at face value, there appears to be two different approaches, as ACFID's commitment at 1.5 requires members to have a PSEA policy. So the policy does not need to include harassment, whereas other donors such as DFAT and DFID require a PSEAH policy. So H, of course, refers to harassment. So just wanted to unpack that a little bit. ACFID's members are already required to have an anti-sexual harassment policy, which covers staff and volunteers. This is located in our compliance indicator at 9.2.3. However, sexual harassment is not isolated to staff and volunteers, and our approaches should also serve to protect primary stakeholders from sexual harassment. This is why the prevention of sexual harassment is set out in a number of the incoming changes to the quality assurance framework. So when taken together, they do form an organisational-wide approach to PSEAH. I'd like to hand over now to Joe and Belinda. But before I do, we did want to play a short video, very short video. It does feature the voices of those in country who have experienced sexual exploitation and abuse. It's a bit harrowing, but it does also, you know, we're kind of acutely aware that we're all sitting in Australia talking to Australians in an H headquarters kind of environment and very far removed from those in the communities to whom we serve. So it also highlights the reason for why we're doing the work that we're doing in terms of safeguarding against PSEAH, against sexual exploitation and abuse. So we'll play this one for you.
You people should have taken care of me. Instead, you abandoned me.
In this community, no one can access corn soya blend without having sex first.
The girls are orphans. They don't have a mother or a father. If they think the abuse can help them, they will go and try to do these things to get food.
I leave my child with my little sister, who is 10 years old. And I dress good, and I go where the NGOs workers drink or live. And one of them will ask me for sex. Sometimes they give me things like food, oil, soap, and I will sell them and get money.
Aid workers have so much power that people treat them as really important, and the community cannot challenge them.
If something happens, you should report it. But in addition to this, there must be action taken. The organization should dismiss the person so that other men will learn that you cannot go around abusing children in this way. Often no action is taken, and that is the problem.
When Ma asked me to go to the stream to wash plates, a peacekeeper asked me to take my clothes off so that he can take a picture. When I asked him to give me money, he told me, no money for children, only biscuits.
I told them what the soldier did to me, but they never told me what happened to him. Until I know what happened to him, I will never have peace.
I've had a man try to lock me in his office to rape me so I could get a UN job.
One of the guys pulls down my t-shirt to reveal my breasts. I was so shocked, I didn't know what to say. So I made a joke saying this was something I should report to HR. He was HR.
Investigation teams are made up of police and lawyers who are more interested in legal definitions than in the survivor. Women are not believed, and that goes to the heart of it all.
Sexual harassment and assault was supposedly forbidden in their code of conduct. When the incident was reported, their only concern was their reputation, and they wanted to make sure I would not speak out.
So that was a short video that was shown in the UK at the 2018 DFID Safeguarding Conference called Putting People First. It's really important, we think, to remind ourselves that this is about more than simply compliance with a code or a policy. As NGOs working in higher risk contexts, we have ethical, moral, legal and contractual obligations to our own staff, to our partners' staff and to the primary stakeholders in countries where we work. That should be our primary concern and obligation. We've also seen over the past 18 months or so the devastating impact that breaches of this trust and risk management procedures has had on individual victims, survivors, on individual NGOs and on the reputation of the sector as a whole. So for some members who are possibly thinking, what has this got to do with us? And why do we need yet another compliance requirement and policy? We hope that hearing from people directly affected in that video, that it'll put it into context for you. Thanks for the introduction, Sophie, and hello everyone. We'll assume for this webinar that you've all read or had a reasonable look through the ACFID guidance document for developing a PSEAH policy. So for the remainder of the webinar, we're going to walk you through some of the key or more critical points included in that guidance document. There'll be time for question and answers at the end of the webinar, and we can see some of your questions already popping up, which we'll come back to at the end. So keep those coming through. Just as a, to put into context why we even need a policy provides an important statement for your organisation and its leadership's commitment to PSEAH and can be used to communicate that commitment to internal and external stakeholders. On its own, of course, it won't foster a strong or positive culture, which would enable safeguarding, but it is a really important component in achieving that. So first, let's consider the actions or steps in developing a policy, a PSEAH policy. Most of the actions or steps outlined here, as you can see there on the slide, are probably similar to the development of any new policy position that you have in your organisation. In particular, it would be similar to how your organisation developed its child protection policy. I'm just going to focus on a couple of these aspects to draw your attention to. So consulting with internal and external stakeholders, which includes your staff, your partners, governing body members, will create ownership and raise awareness and ensure that your policy is relevant and appropriate to your organisation. So one size does not fit all with this. Consultation with your in-country partners will also build shared understandings of what PSEAH even means and ensure that procedures that you might develop with them are contextualised and culturally and gender appropriate. And even reflecting an understanding of local legislative frameworks in different countries. The notion of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment and acceptable and unacceptable behaviours is understood in different ways in different cultures and contexts. So this is where these consultations become really important. You could do this by holding face-to-face consultations with staff, if that's possible. And also with partners, if that's possible. For some smaller organisations, that may be difficult, so you could consider having these conversations by Skype, or even by Skype rather, or even holding a webinar. Consulting with the affected communities or primary stakeholders is really critical and perhaps one of the key differences with the development of this type of policy as compared with many of your other organisational policies. It's so important because the implementation of this policy or its failure could directly and negatively affect those people, the affected communities or primary stakeholders. It's critical that you understand the risks that people face that could either be created or exacerbated by some of your projects or your partnerships so that you can raise awareness amongst that group, discuss with them what would be acceptable and unacceptable behaviours and expectations so that people are really clear on that, and seek input to the design of any complaints mechanism that you would develop. This consultation with your communities could also form the basis of developing what's referred to as community-based complaints mechanisms, which would be considered to be the best practice or gold standard practice. This could be challenging, I imagine, for some of the smaller members. Maybe you don't have a lot of time working directly in communities. That may happen through partners. So you could consider doing this through your local partners, or if that isn't even possible, consider asking larger ACFID members for some of their findings in similar contexts. Many of the issues may be similar. If you're able to do this directly in communities, you could do it through holding small community meetings, or having individual conversations with people that weren't able to attend community meetings, and that could be marginalised women who may not be able to attend a whole of community meeting, people living with a disability, or the elderly. You should also definitely consider, if you're having those conversations or meetings, holding them separately with men or women so that people can speak freely. This policy, like many policies, it's really important to get governing body endorsement, but particularly so with this policy. Each ACFID member will have your own system for doing this, of providing draft policies to your board and getting their endorsement. But in relation to the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment policy, it's really important that it's got the involvement, understanding and formal endorsement of your governing body, because they're ultimately accountable for managing the risks, and they will be accountable for managing any complaints and reporting processes. It also helps to ensure that there's leadership within your organisation for the issue, and for influencing a culture of awareness and zero tolerance, and a culture that welcomes complaints or concerns. Once you've got your policy developed, very important to share that and communicate it widely through your organisation and with partners and communities. In particular, the expected behaviours of staff towards each other and towards community members, and also how your complaints mechanisms work and how people can access those. Developing shared understandings of both acceptable and unacceptable behaviours is really important, vital to putting your policy into practice. These need to be well socialised so that staff and communities are comfortable identifying or determining what is unacceptable behaviour and calling it out if necessary, and that is making a complaint or reporting an incident or concern.
So that covers the key steps to undertaking a policy. What we're going to do next is just walk you through the different elements of a PSEAH policy. So you can see here on this slide that these outline basically the key elements or the suggested architecture of a PSEAH policy. Some of these elements will look really familiar to you. They would form the basic outline of what we'd normally expect to see in any policy. So for example, you've got elements there like a title, a statement of commitment, your policy principles, the scope of policy, and linkages to other kind of key procedures or policy documents. But there's also a few elements here that are listed that are very particular to PSEAH. So you can see there on the top line, there's a yellow icon that relates to standards of conduct and recruitment. This is particular to PSEAH and safeguarding. And in the second line there's a green icon relating to reporting. So this relates to some of the reporting mechanisms that Sophie and Joe have already mentioned. And an orange icon in the second row that refers to risk assessment. So we're going to spend a bit of time in this webinar focusing on those particular aspects of a PSEAH policy, as well as some of the other areas too. So first up is determining what the scope of your policy will be, and that will obviously determine what you call your policy as well. In terms of scope, you'll just need to think about and determine what works best for your organisation. So whether you have the approach of having a broader safeguarding policy, which has tended to date to be the approach of lots of organisations in the UK, or whether you have a standalone or separate prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, or
the Prevention of Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment policy. You may decide to incorporate child protection and the protection of vulnerable adults into the single policy, which you would call a safeguarding policy, for instance, or to highlight the differences in separate policies. And that can serve to raise awareness of those particular issues. Certainly our experience, I think, of having a separate focus on child protection over the last, what's it been, 5 or 10 years in the Australian NGO sector, has succeeded in raising awareness and prominence of that issue. It's given it real traction in organisations. So there are some benefits to taking that approach. But essentially it's up to each organisation to choose. Just remember though that if you choose to include harassment in with your other HR policies rather than this policy, just be sure to include sexual harassment and also harassment towards primary stakeholders as well as just staff. Many of you, your HR policies may just deal with staff at the moment, so just bear that in mind.
Another area that we wanted to touch on today are the policy principles that would normally underpin a PSEAH policy. This is not a mandatory section of a PSEAH policy, but we thought we'd outline them here because it can be very helpful for organisations to think about what drives and underpins the policy that they take and the values and mandate of their organisation. So the principles we've got listed here are just suggestions, but they're pretty typical to the discourse that's been building around approaches to PSEAH over many years and certainly in the last 18 months. So you can see there's zero tolerance of inaction, shared responsibility, accountability and transparency, and a survivor-centred approach, as well as shared responsibility and gender equality. We're just going to focus on a couple of these today that we wanted to talk about. One is zero tolerance to inaction. So I think being in the sector, you'd all be very aware of the criticisms that have been levelled at organisations who've either known about incidents of exploitation or abuse and have perhaps not investigated the allegation, or even worse, not acted. Essentially, the principle of zero tolerance to inaction means an organisation is committed to acting on every allegation of SEAH in accordance with their policy commitments. This means undertaking an investigation that's fair and responsive, and then responding to the findings of that allegation or that investigation. So this principle of zero tolerance underpins the UN's approach. It's also a principle that DFAT has adopted in the ITS policy, and many international NGOs have also adopted this policy principle. Secondly, we wanted to just spend time looking at a survivor-centred approach. And I know there's already been a couple of questions come through on this as a policy principle. What's important to know about a survivor-centred approach is that it doesn't overstep issues of procedural fairness. What it does is focus the attention on survivor. So again, many of you would be aware that one of the strongest criticisms made in the UK independent inquiry last year was that many of the PSEAH efforts to date have largely been focused on organisations' internal reputational management priorities, rather than the victims or survivors. One of the key recommendations that came out of the independent inquiry last year, and a commitment made by the Australian government and many other donors, was that victims and survivors should be central to all of our efforts to prevent or manage sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. We refer to this in PSEAH discourse as a survivor-centred approach. It's reflected in the language of the ACFID Compliance Indicator 1.5.1, which calls on members to demonstrate their organisational commitment to the prevention of SEA through a survivor-centred approach. So it's been enshrined really within the code. Essentially, when we talk about a survivor-centred approach, it prioritises the rights, the needs, the wishes, the safety, and the empowerment of survivors at all times. So in practical terms, a survivor-centred approach requires that, and you'll see this on the screen, expected behaviours of staff are communicated to all stakeholders. And as Jo's already mentioned, this includes communicating behaviours to beneficiaries and communities so that they know what is expected. Secondly, that complaints mechanisms are accessible to survivors, complainants, witnesses, and that they're able to file complaints and have confidence that assistance will be rapidly and sensitively delivered. This means, as Jo's already mentioned, that community-based complaints mechanisms are ideally identified and developed in close consultation with beneficiaries, especially women and girls, that they feel that the mechanism is appropriate to them and that it's safe to use. Thirdly, that investigation processes are professional and prioritise the safety and needs of the victim and survivor, while also providing procedural fairness. That responses are sensitive to the wishes and safety of survivors, so that we listen to survivors and understand how they want the response to be made in a way that keeps them safe. And finally, that whoever it is, complainants, survivors or victims, receive appropriate assistance. That might mean medical assistance, legal, psychosocial or other assistance in a timely and effective manner. And where an organisation receives a complaint that falls outside the scope of its policy, for example, that it's aimed at an organisation that is separate, that the organisation refers the complainant or the survivor to the relevant organisation to ensure that a response is provided. So this broad approach acknowledges that sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment has a profound impact on survivors, and it can include, obviously, both immediate and long-term consequences.
So another element of your policy is considering the scope of its application. This is probably pretty similar notion that you've had to consider with all of your policies. In relation to a PSEAH policy, you'll need to consider to whom and how the policy will apply. So importantly, just bear in mind that that means to whom sanctions may apply if the policy is breached. It's important to remember to include partners and visitors to projects as well. Your policy's scope of application really should extend to all people who could conceivably pose a risk to vulnerable people, whether those people are other staff members or members of the community. Belinda's going to provide some tips on how to apply the policy to your partners now.
So we know that the risk of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment is highest in the field. This is obviously where our staff and our partners are working directly with vulnerable people. And this is usually where the power imbalance is most significant. So the ACFID Code of Conduct requires you to extend your PSEAH policy to your partners. And if your organisation is DFAT funded, it's also a DFAT policy requirement. So including a section in your policy that addresses how you'll share these obligations with your partners is really important. This will obviously be really different for each ACFID member. Obviously, we've got a real range of members and contexts. It will depend on the nature of your work, the risk context where you work, and the type of partners you work with. So for example, some of you will have partners that don't have contact with primary stakeholders, whereas others will be directly implementing in communities or directly implementing in communities in humanitarian contexts. So it will be the partner portfolio that you have that will really drive what this section of your policy looks like. At a minimum, partners need to be included in the scope of your policy, as Jo's just said. But to provide further guidance, some of the things that you can think about addressing your policy are listed on that slide. So it can be looking at defining how the policy might apply to different types of partners with varying risk profiles, outlining how PSEAH will be incorporated into due diligence or partner capacity assessment processes, commitment to providing training and other support to your partners, requiring PSEAH obligations to be reflected in partner agreements, and committing to monitoring partner compliance. So you'll see here that in the same way that our sector has worked really hard over many years to develop partner capacity and child safeguarding, ACFID members also need to work pretty closely with partners now to develop their own PSEAH policy and practices that are aligned with the requirements set out in the code and make sense to partners and their working contexts.
So when we undertook consultations with members for the review of the code with regards to PSEAH, lots of members were worried about policy overload. which is understandable. So many compliance requirements. This makes it very important then that you make clear linkages between your policy on PSEAH, however you approach that, and other policies that you have in your organisation, like child protection or your complaints policy. Really important that the linkages are clear, but also that the requirements that you outline in those policies are consistent amongst the policies. So the most likely policies that you might need to ensure linkages, where linkages are clear and to ensure consistency, would be your child protection policy, as I mentioned, your if you have one, your anti-bullying and harassment policy, or whatever it might be called in your organisation, whistleblowing policy, your complaints mechanism or complaints policy, recruitment policies, gender policy, and if you have an organisational code of conduct, to make sure that there are all internal consistencies there between those. And I'd probably say of particular note would be your complaints policy and your organisational staff code of conduct.
So, as you'd all be very aware, the ACFID Code of Conduct currently requires members to have a code of conduct that sets out expected staff behaviours. And this is also a requirement if your organisation is DFAT funded under the PSEAH policy. It's therefore important that your standards of conduct or your code of conduct is referenced in your policy. In the last year, Joe and I have looked at complaints mechanisms in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, in refugee responses in Kenya and Uganda, and also in responses in Sri Lanka and Indonesia. We've been looking at this through the lens of the core humanitarian standard. And one of the things that's become really clear for us is that vulnerable people generally do not have clear expectations of how staff should behave unless these are explicitly communicated to them. Vulnerable communities have often experienced abuse of power in various forms, as many of you would know and are familiar with. So they're unlikely to know what they can expect from aid or humanitarian staff, and they're unlikely to know how or if they can register a complaint. So this is why the documentation of a code of conduct and the communication of that code is such an important strategy to preventing SEAH and also to being accountable to victims and survivors. So the development of PSEAH policies will prompt many of our ACFID members to review their existing codes of conduct to make sure that these now address PSEAH. So as you do this, you may want to consider some of the following, and we've just listed some prompts here for you on this slide. So some of the adaptations to standards of conduct might include the following. A, and obviously, explicitly prohibiting any form of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. Also mandating in your code of conduct that it's essential to report any suspected or alleged cases of SEAH. Ensuring that everyone knows expected behaviours and how to raise complaints. Ensuring that it's clear to your staff and representatives and partners that failure to comply is grounds for disciplinary action and may result in termination. So basically clearly outlining the consequences of failing to comply. And letting your staff know and your partners know that conduct that is criminal will be reported to the relevant authorities.
So your reporting procedures are also an important element to include in your policy. Having a complaints and reporting procedure that's clear and readily accessible, and by that we mean really authentically accessible to people in communities and to all staff members, regardless of their seniority and so on. Ensuring that that's accessible is critical to fostering and ensuring accountability. The reporting procedure is what is followed once a complaint is received. It can sometimes be a bit confusing around where a complaints procedure or mechanism that we refer to starts and stops and where a reporting procedure starts and stops. They're really two parts of the same beast. So you'll need a complaints procedure to receive complaints, and then a reporting procedure really refers to the process then that complaint would take through your organisation and potentially to external bodies as well. It's really important that you have a clear and well socialised reporting procedure that meets the principles of, and some of these are listed here, procedural fairness, protection of privacy, ensures the needs, wishes and safety of complainants and survivors are met, and one that is non-retaliatory and that people have faith in that. It is directly linked to your complaints mechanisms, and you may have these outlined in the same procedural document, or you may have them as separate procedures. That's up to each organisation. As a minimum, the verifier I'll just draw your attention to for compliance indicator 1.5.1, which is the one that relates to the policy requirement in the ACFID Code of Conduct. It requires you to specify your organisation's reporting responsibilities where an incident is identified, and which must include processes for reporting to local enforcement authorities and be subject to the wishes and welfare of the complainant and survivor.
So the final area that we wanted to touch on was risk assessment and management. So the ACFID Code of Conduct also requires members to ensure that safeguarding is always considered in any of your risk assessments. So it makes sense to refer to this within your PSEAH policy. Now we know that the risk of SEAH will vary depending on an enormous range of factors. Like child safeguarding, the approach organisations take to preventing sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment will vary depending on either the cultural context, the level of existing gender inequality, social norms, power differences, and the likelihood of contact with very vulnerable people. And obviously there's a whole range of risk factors in addition to these that you'll need to think about. We know that understanding and identifying increased areas of risks in your partnerships, in your projects, in your context of work, are really important to being able to put in place the appropriate and additional mitigation measures so that those risks are authentically managed to safeguard people.
So through all of that, we've run through for you the key steps or processes you might go through to develop a policy, and then also the elements of what you would include in your policy. We all know that a policy on its own won't reduce the risks associated with sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment. We heard earlier, though, that a policy provides a really important statement, public statement and internal statement of your organisation and its leadership's commitment to PSEAH, and can be used to communicate this commitment internally and also to external stakeholders. So while the policy on its own won't foster that culture that we're looking for, a strong and positive culture which enables safeguarding, the policy is a really important component in achieving that. To implement your policies, the requirements of your policies, a good place to start after you've developed it is to develop a plan for its implementation and how you're going to monitor that implementation in an ongoing way. We know from our experiences with child protection and from the reflections over the last 12 or 18 months that the internal culture of an organisation is really critical to preventing PSEAH. I think it was one of the key findings that came out of the independent inquiry in the UK, that it was the culture of organisations that really needed to change. So we need to build that internal culture that prioritises and proactively recognises and addresses the power and structural inequalities that remain at the root cause of this issue for us, and where staff and others, including beneficiaries in communities, can recognise unacceptable behaviours and feel comfortable and safe reporting that with no fear of retaliation. Over to you, Sophie.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Jo and Belinda. Resources available. I walked you through the good practice toolkit before, and you could see the resources section at the bottom of commitment 1.5. So we have highlighted where they are, and those three arrows point to some of our favourites. So I just the third one down is the guidance for the development of a prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment policy, which was largely authored by Joe and Belinda, and you can see the picture on the left-hand side. Also very useful is the best practice guide for interagency community-based complaints mechanisms with regards to PSEAH. So that helps unpack how to set up a community-based complaints mechanism and to ensure that it's running smoothly and well. And the other one was the CHS Alliance, the Guidelines for Investigations. So useful to understanding how to conduct an investigation and how to manage an investigation. So it's time now for Q&A. We've, of course, left ourselves not as long as we wanted to, and I apologise for that. But we do see quite a few questions come through, which is great. I might, one of the questions, I'll kick it off. And so one of the questions came in about how about suppliers? And I assume that means does the code requirements extend beyond implementing partners to suppliers? And the answer to that is possibly no. By implementing partners, we define a partner as an individual group or organisation that collaborates with ACFID members to achieve mutually agreed objectives in development and humanitarian initiatives. So not less so just a direct supplier of goods and services, but more an in-country implementing partner that's either implementing the activity on behalf of the partner or in coordination with the partner. Hopefully that answers that question. And also one of the questions was, as the peak body for NGOs, what will ACFID's specific role be involved with the implementation of the policy in terms of compliance and oversight and making sure our members have policies in place? Briefly, again, we will be using the usual annual compliance reporting system that we have in place to track and monitor member compliance with how they're going with having developed the policy and implementing it with partners. One of the changes that is coming in is that it does require members to pop their PSEAH policy or PSEAH policies up on their website. So that will be in effect on the 31st of December. So we should have visibility over those policies through spot checks. And ultimately, we look forward to, we'll probably have a call-in of those policies in the future, but definitely not at this very stage. So we understand that members have drafted policies, are in the process of ratifying those policies, and most importantly, we'll be looking at how they're implementing those policies with members, with implementing partners at present. And I also note a really good point about ACFID conducting a future forum to share practical experience in implementing the policies with partners on the ground. Again, we like to harness the good work that our members do. We don't have all the answers ourselves, and some of our members are really leading the way and already have doing amazing things with their partners in leading prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So in terms of our role, we will be looking at hosting forums and also digital online forums to help share what they've done and how they've gone about it to help the members that are still progressing in this space. So point acknowledged, thank you. Jo and Belinda, did you can see the questions. I wonder if you would like to take the lead on answering any of them, especially one about an example of a community-based complaints mechanism, potentially, you could start off with.
Start with the community-based complaints mechanism one?
Why not, yeah.
Okay. An example. Okay, so I can tell you about one that I saw recently in Sri Lanka, which was where the NGO had gone to pretty extensive lengths to consult with community members. So they'd spent time in the community running both community forums with men and women separately and together, and they'd also gone door to door to houses of people that may not have been able to attend a community forum. And through those meetings, they made sure that they really thoroughly understood what people currently understood around acceptable behaviours and how they might articulate that. And they spent time with those people, I suppose, working through to a shared position on what acceptable and unacceptable behaviours look like, and focusing on what unacceptable behaviours looks like is also a really important element of that, because often people find it hard to recognise, and I think it is hard to recognise sometimes that grey area, the difference, but the more that you can talk about that with communities, I think the clearer it becomes. They then developed a complaints mechanism based on that, based on all those discussions around what people might feel most comfortable, what processes they would feel most comfortable using. In one community I went to, people said that they were comfortable using existing community mechanisms, so community leaders within their community, and forums that they had that were already existing. In another community I was in, though, people said they were not comfortable doing that. So that could be for a whole myriad of reasons, trust or power differentials, personalities, all sorts of things. And so in that circumstance, they wanted to have a dedicated phone number that they could SMS to, which was very accessible to all the community members, that technology. They wanted a phone number that they could call, and they wanted an anonymous complaints box in the community where they could write something down and put in concerns into there. And there were really strict rules, if you like, around how those complaints boxes were managed, and that was very clearly communicated to community members. So they felt confidence in how that would be managed. So the NGO, the person and the focal person within the organisation that was dedicated to this had the key to check what was in that box. So not just anyone could access it. And they knew that whatever was in that box would go to the focal person within the organisation. So they're the sorts of features that you would be looking for. And the process of getting to that point is just as important, really, because that's the part where you're consulting with the community to try and deeply understand the sorts of issues that they're facing and how they might define or be able to articulate what acceptable and unacceptable behaviours are. That was quite a long answer. Sorry. What other ones have we got here?
I might address the one from Fifi, I think it is, around suppliers. It's a really good point that you've made, and I think we didn't include that in our scope slide. But what we're already seeing of policies that have been developed is that the scope is really broad, so it does cover suppliers. And we've also seen policies that also include major donors. So again, thinking carefully about, say, sponsors of children, major donors, corporate donors who might visit your projects, suppliers that are working with you, and thinking carefully about whether there's risks that exist in your relationships with those types of entities or individuals, and ensuring that your policy has coverage wherever you see risk.
Done?
Yep.
There's a couple of questions here that I think are worth, that we need to address, because this comes up quite a bit. From Ian, please expand on the requirements that our policy should extend to survivors whose complaint may not be covered by our policy. In what circumstances could this arise? It's a really good question, and it's I think an extension of our practice that lots of organisations find quite challenging. So the types of things that this could be is if it comes to your notice within a community, someone makes a complaint that there is an incident involving PSEAH that might be between two community members, for instance. So it's not a staff member of the NGO committing the offence or the alleged offence, but it's still come to your knowledge that something has happened. And in that instance, that's an example where you need to be able to refer that complaint to the appropriate authorities, and also to ensure that the people involved are getting the necessary support. So that's where your referral systems may be too. what other instances?
It could be, I mean, similarly, you could see a complaint against a teacher in a school. You could see a complaint against an aid worker or a humanitarian worker or any worker that's not inside your organisations. We all assume that primary stakeholders have, clearly understand where each of us come from, but they may not necessarily know which organisation someone belongs to, but they know that something's wrong. So the point being here is that if your organisation receives a complaint or is advised of an incident, then with respect to that survivor or that complainant, you've got an obligation to find a pathway for that person to register their complaint with the relevant entity or individual.
There's another question here around the survivor-centred approach, and I've had this discussion has come up in other forums actually too. The survivor-centred approach to investigation makes the interests of the victim paramount. I could see that this requirement may well create legal difficulties for the charity, as the person complained about may well be able to argue that this approach is unbalanced or biased. So I think a really important point to make about the commitment to taking a survivor-centred approach is that this is not intended to bias the outcome of an investigation. This is all about shifting the focus away from the protection of an organisation's reputation, which previously has been much of the focus in PSEAH, and not appropriately reporting it, and shifting that focus back to the complainant or the victim or survivor to ensure that the complainant or survivor is able to really authentically access a complaints mechanism, that they're safe and that their needs are met, and that could be through medical or legal support and so on. But it isn't at the expense of procedural fairness. It should not be.
There's a question there from Laura, which is probably a question that many organisations would love the answer to. We don't have it. So the question is, for accredited NGOs, will PSEAH become a red flag similar to child protection? We certainly can't speak for DFAT, but I think it's fair to say that as a safeguarding issue, it will be important. But like child protection, I think DFAT and ACFID's approach is to encourage organisations to implement this authentically, which takes time. So it's not a definitive answer, but I think over time you may well see that there's an increased focus on this as a red flag. It's certainly an issue of real priority for the sector. But I think the investment at this point in time is making sure that organisations are really spending time with their partners, their boards, their staff, to set in place the right mechanisms to manage this well.
There's a couple of questions here that relate to what sort of support might be provided for members or for NGOs from either ACFID or DFAT around developing tools and training and so on. Sophie's gone through some of that ACFID, the sort of support ACFID will provide. DFAT does have plans to develop some e-learning modules around this for partners. So hopefully they'll be available for NGO partners as well.
There's also a question here from Helen Turner asking what recommendations we might have for the types of budget you might need for safeguarding implementation. It's a really good question, and I don't think we can answer that one either. But I think it is important, like we've seen in any implementation of policy, that this does take resourcing. So one of the ACFID requirements is that organisations have a PSEAH focal point. It doesn't mean that organisations need to recruit a brand new person to take on that position, but it does mean that there's likely cost involved in ensuring that people in your organisation have got the right training to understand SEAH well, to establish reporting mechanisms, as Jo's outlined, that are appropriate and to manage. And what we are already seeing in many organisations is that with the spotlight on SEAH, you do receive an increased number of allegations, and that takes time to investigate and respond to. So I don't think there's an answer to how much you need to put aside, but no doubt it will have a resource implication.
There has been, interestingly, in the discourse, I know some advocacy efforts in the UK at least, and I think here as well, to DFID and DFAT to acknowledge that this is an area that will require more resourcing to try and advocate to them that it should be a legitimate budget item, if you like. So I think we just all need to continue that those advocacy efforts with donors.
Great. Jo and Belinda, thank you. I kind of feel that we're 10 minutes over, so there are some other questions and we can see who's asking them, which is great, which means that where possible, we will attempt to communicate with you via email to let you know some of those where we can contribute to the answer. So thanks everyone for engaging with the webinar and for being so interested. You know, the breadth of questions just shows how much work we're all doing, but how much work we've all got to do. So I'd like you to invite you to stay on the webinar. We've got about 3 questions to wrap up like a survey, just to see help inform us as to whether our webinars can be strengthened and made more effective in the future. So we'd love you just to answer that tiny, weeny, short questionnaire. So please stay on board, and we look forward to sharing the YouTube recording of the webinar with you later this week. Thanks, Jo and Belinda. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.